Hi folks, my name is Thibaut Van Dam and I am a DIY singer-songwriter based in Southeast London, and I'm also a guitar tutor. And today I'm very excited to be back on my channel, continuing my series about practical guitar and music theory, looking at lesson 31, where we talk about secondary dominants in more detail. The last video I made was lesson 30, where I was doing an analysis of a song called So Sorry by the musician Feist. And I love this song because it is one of the most clear, obvious examples of a secondary dominant, and it does exactly what you think secondary dominants will do. It made the song sound refreshing and different, and it almost communicated functional harmony in a completely different way. And I think that that's a super useful thing to know how to do. And so while I was making that video, I wanted to use the song as an example of secondary dominants, and I realized I was a bit ambitious in trying to both analyze the song and simultaneously actually explain secondary dominants because they are quite a complex idea. Also, reviewing that video, I realized that there are a few techniques of explaining secondary dominants that might actually be a little bit more helpful, and I wanted a second go at sort of explaining them, and I wanted to make a separate video just exclusively about secondary dominants because they're so useful, and as one YouTuber called them, the most important music theory idea you'll ever learn, which I don't agree with, but I will agree that they sound really interesting. And to give you an idea what you might be in for in today's lesson, let's go ahead and showcase what a secondary dominant actually can do. So the song that I'm going to be doing is the song from the last video called So Sorry by Feist. So I'm sure that throughout that you got this idea of a lot of stuff that was predictable, and then out of nowhere, something was unpredictable. Something came out of the blue. And it's this chord here. This is a secondary dominant. And in the last video, I did explain what we call that, how to actually describe secondary dominants. And I did try to explain where secondary dominants actually come from, but I don't think it can be explained really enough because there are so many implications of the idea of a secondary dominant that I'm more than happy to do another video now. So if this sounds interesting, please consider liking the video. Please consider subscribing to the channel. It is the best way to stay in the loop. It motivates me to keep making content, and it is why I'm here right now. Thank you to everyone that does subscribe. It really does mean a lot. And let's go ahead and get started. I have so much to say. I recommend you have a notebook and something to write with. And I'm going to start by going through the prerequisites, the things you have to know in order to understand this topic. And I will spend the absolute minimum amount of time on these topics that I can, if possible, just so I can get to this topic. But I wouldn't feel good if I just jumped right in and assumed you knew all this. That said, I am assuming you do know a lot of this stuff, which is why you're watching this video now. And if you don't, I have made videos about every single one of these topics I'm about to go into. So check out those videos if you do find yourself a bit lost. And you can even make a checklist as I go through this. The first thing you need to know is the chromatic scale. The chromatic scale are the 12 notes that you can play on a guitar. And there are only 12 notes, and there aren't 13, and that is it. And there are 12 notes running from A to G sharp. And in between some of these notes are sharps or flats, depending on how you think of the notes. Okay. The next thing you need to know is equal temperament. Equal temperament basically tells us that each note has equal musical and functional opportunity and value to every other note. And so because of that, I like to compare the idea of notes instead of being letters, which seem to be of substance and meaning, like A comes before C in the alphabet. Instead, I like to think about them like singular digits on a ruler, for example, 0 or 1 or 2, that each of these numbers, a number is a number. And in that sense, yes, technically you could say 4 is greater than 3, but I like to think about it like more equal. And then we start to deconstruct the idea of notes themselves. The next thing that you need to know is the idea of intervals. And this is why I bring out the ruler, because intervals tell us the amount of space between any two notes. Remember, considering every single note is of equal space, then therefore we can have intervals between any two notes, right? So for example, the space between 0 and 2 is 2 inches, or we could say 2 notes in this case. And the space between 2 and 4 is also 2 inches or 2 notes. So this is what I mean by the idea of equivalency and universality between the notes, that the amount of space between A and B is the same as the amount of space between B and C sharp. And that is because B doesn't have a sharp. B just goes to C and then C sharp, and that's why you need to know your chromatic scale. Okay, now the next thing you need to know are intervals. Not intervals, triads. You need to know triads. Triads tell us that when we stack 3 notes and they have an amount of space between them, we can form major and minor chords. These are simple chords and they're called triads. And the major and minor chords are comprised of these intervals called the root, whatever the note is, whatever you want it to be. Remember, all the notes have equal opportunity. So you can make a major chord out of any of the notes, just like you can make a minor chord out of any of the notes as well. And it involves a root, a relative perfect fifth, and a relative major or minor third. And that third will define whether or not the chord is a major chord or a minor chord. Okay. Then you need to know chord extensions. Chord extensions specifically tell us that when you stack 4 notes or 1 additional note, that you start to further proliferate the nature of the chord. That the chord becomes either major 7th or minor 7th, or in fact dominant. And each of these have formulas. And it's worth pointing out that these formulas are universal between all the notes. So all to say that working hand in hand with the cage system, which is something that weirdly you wouldn't need to know about this, for this video, but the idea that this is a major shape and so is that, and this is a dominant shape and so is this, and that's because they have the exact same formula: a root, a fifth, a major third, and a minor 7th. Okay, the next thing you need to know is the idea of the major scale itself. The major scale is a series of notes that are separated by either whole steps or half steps that ultimately present to us something that we have described and call major. So that is the major scale, in this case, the C major scale, but this is also the major scale. And that scale is only one scale. There's only one major scale, and it varies the notes specifically you play, but the amount of spaces between the notes doesn't vary. And again, this has to do with equal temperament and the fact that each note has equal function and opportunity to every other note. That's why it's so important you know the earlier stuff too. And then you need to know the harmonized major 7th, or the harmonized major scale and the harmonized major 7th scale, which is ultimately to say that when you stack notes, you start to form chords. And ultimately major 7th, minor 7th, and dominant chords, and that this tells us which major, minor, and diminished chords are associated with each of the scale degrees. 1 is a major 1, 2 is a minor 2, 3 is a minor 3 chord, then the 4 is a major 4, the 5 is a major, and the 6 is minor, and the 7 is diminished, and then we're back to major again, because we go back to the beginning of the scale. So again, I'm breezing through a lot of this stuff. I'm still 8 minutes in anyway, but you need to know these things. Then the final 2 things you'll have to know are German functional theory and also Roman numerals. Functional theory is the idea that we can associate relative major and minor chords to chord families, the tonic, the subdominant, and the dominant, and that this ultimately helps us understand songwriting. We have a tonic, we have a subdominant, and we have a dominant. When we stack those to their respective 4th diatonic third, major 7-1, major 7-4, dominant 5. And then that the dominant 5 chord wants to go back to the 1, which is called a cadence, a chord progression. One chord goes to another. And that is right around where we'll pick up. Okay, so let's hope that you know all that stuff and let's get into it. So the basis of a secondary dominant, I feel the best way to explain it is that it derives from the primary dominant. And in order to understand what the relationship is and why secondary dominants can even work in the first place, and why the idea of them even seems like something worth trying, the idea is ultimately to know what a dominant 5 chord is, and in a given scale, why the 5 chord, when played as a dominant chord, wants to go back, why there's this musical mathematical tension that wants to take us back to the 1 chord. And once we understand this, then we will be equipped to understanding the function of a secondary dominant. So let's go ahead and start there. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to start with the key of C. This is because C has no accidentals, meaning to say it has no sharps or flats, just natural notes, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. So the scale of C goes C, D, E, F, G, A, B, and C. That is our scale. C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C. Okay. The next thing we need to know is the harmonized major scale formula. That is to say, when we stack those three diatonic thirds, which chords are going to be major, which chords are going to be minor, and how do they associate specifically with each scale degree? The first note in the scale, the second note in the scale, and so on. And what we found when we did that video, and when I went through that idea, is that ultimately the formula ends up always being the same, no matter what key you're in, because of equal temperament. That's why it's so important to know all those other things. Okay, so we end up with the formula. The formula goes major 1, minor 2, minor 3, major 4, major 5, and then minor 6, and diminished 7. And I'm just going to scribble out the second C because we don't actually need it and it's superfluous to the key. So this is our formula. Major 1, minor 2, minor 3, and you can see that the capital is major, the lowercase is minor, and you need to know this in order to understand this idea. So the next thing we want to do is we want to associate to the next diatonic third. We want to know what is the major 7th and minor 7th and dominant and half diminished variations of these same things. And actually, they are always congruent with their majorness or minorness. Everything that's major is a major 7th. Everything that's minor becomes a minor 7th. All except for one instance, which is the 5 chord, the dominant chord. And this is a major chord that ends up with a minor 7th. So we find that we have major 7, 1. We have minor 7, 2. We have minor 7, 3. We have major 7, 4. We have dominant. It's kind of weird, but I'm going to use the shape triangle. The triangle is a symbol for the dominant chord. So triangle 5. So dominant 5. You could also do it with a 7. That also works, a large 7. And then we have the minor 7, 6 chord, which always sounds really weird when I say it, but that is what it is. It is the 6th chord that it played as a minor 7th chord. And then we have the half diminished 7 chord. This is the formula for the harmonized major 7th scale. Major 7, 1, minor 7, 2, minor 7, 3, major 7, 4, dominant 5, minor 7, 6, and half diminished 7. Okay. Functional theory. Why does the 5 as a dominant chord want to go to the 1? This is the big question. If we can understand functionally why this wants to go to that, then we are going to have a much better chance at understanding secondary dominance in a really simple way. So let's go through the 5 chord. The 5 chord is comprised of 4 notes and the respective intervals that make it dominant, which is to say it is a root with a major 3, a perfect 5, and a minor 7th. Okay, so these are the intervals that make up a dominant chord, any dominant chord. And I'll just leave that there in case you need to pause. Okay, now when we are in the key, when we are in any key, the 5 chord specifically, when it is played as a dominant chord, that is to say in the key of C, when we play the chord G major as a G dominant, which is a root, a perfect 5th, a major 3, and a minor 7th, that a lot of things are happening all at once. So the 5-1 cadence works on the basis that the major 3rd interval of the 5th chord in the key is the leading tone of the whole key entirely. So this idea is a very deeply relative concept. The idea that basically the intervals that are inherent to one chord actually have a place both in that chord and also relative to the tonic. All to say that the major 3rd interval of the 5 is actually the 7th scale degree or the 7th note in the scale, also known as the leading tone. The leading tone is an important note because it gives us the impression of resolve. We want to hear the 1. And to give you the best example of this, I'm just going to play the scale and you'll know what I mean. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 1. We want to hear the 7 go to the 1. So on the basis that the major 3rd interval of the 5 chord is in fact the leading tone of the key altogether, we want to hear it resolve back to the 1. This is the first reason we want to hear the resolve. This is why the 5-1 cadence works, whether the chords are dominant, whether the 5 chord is dominant or not. The next reason why we are motivated to go to the 1 when we play it specifically as a dominant chord has to do with the fact that there is a minor 7th and the major 3. Now these two notes specifically, the minor 7th of the 5 chord and the major 3 of the 5 chord produce a tritone. And it's crunchy, and we usually don't like that tension. And so that is the energy, the musical energy that makes us say we need to get out of this pronto. This already makes us say we want to go back to the 1. We're probably going to go there, but this is our reason. This puts a fire up our butts to say, let's move, let's move, let's move. Boom, C. So this is how we kind of end up with the 5-1 authentic cadence. The idea that we want to resolve the musical tension. There is a tritone located underneath the leading tone, which is making us feel uncomfortable musically in a way that's very musical and very functional. Okay, now some things to take note of about when we resolve to the 1 is that in order to resolve this tension, we don't actually need to articulate whether or not the 1 will be a major 1 or in fact a minor 1. Now, if we want to go back to the key, we will stay as a major 1. But in all of the excitement and all of the musical tension, we just are happy to get out of that tritone in the leading tone. We're just happy to get out of this and resolve to this, the C5 or C suspension. We don't need to know if it's going to be major or minor. Literally anything. We'll take anything. We'll even take suspended. Imagine this. That feels oddly the most satisfying of all of them because it's not articulated. We don't know if it's major or minor. We don't need to know. Okay, so these are some things to keep in mind as we move forward, starting to look at the secondary dominant. The next thing we need to do is we need to talk about the circle of fifths. The circle of fifths is going to be our single most valuable tool for identifying secondary dominance according to any key. That is because, of course, the circle of fifths illustrates to us every single key we can possibly play. So let's go ahead and use our mnemonic phrases to identify the first section of the circle of fifths. Starting at 12 o'clock and then going clockwise, we're going to say C for Caroline. And then going clockwise, we're going to say G for gets, D for drunk, A for and, E for eats, B for butter, and F for flies which taste bitter or sharp. And this is what we end up with. This is our circle of fifths part of the way. C, Caroline gets drunk and eats butter, flies which taste sharp. Okay, now we're going to go back to 11 o'clock, just before the C. We're going to go counterclockwise, and we are going to say F for flat, and then we're going to spell out the word bead. B, E, A, and D. Let's go ahead and do that. That's going counterclockwise, by the way. B, flat, B, E, A, D. This is my modest contribution to music theory. I invented this. I say flat bead because flat reminds us that B is flat, E is flat, A is flat, and D is flat. B flat, E flat, A flat, D flat. Flat bead. Okay. So let's go ahead and add in our flat symbols. Great. Now, just for the sake of it, let's put in some relative minors to some of these notes. These are all of the possible notes we can play. This is the full chromatic scale, even though it's not organized according alphabetically, but in fact organized according to both fifths and fourths, actually, because it's going both directions. For example, C is the 5 of F, but F is the 4 of C, just like B flat is the 4 of F, and it goes in this direction. Now, this is kind of the heartland. This is where a lot of the most rudimentary ideas of how to locate secondary dominance come from. But for now, let's just go ahead and identify the relative minors. So the relative minor of C is A minor, and then G is E minor, and F is D minor. So let's go ahead and write those in. A, D minor, and then E minor. And we could do more, like D is B minor, A is F sharp, E is C sharp. You start to memorize it over time. B is going to be G sharp, And we just have those sort of available. Now, we know how to identify a key using the circle of fifths. When we find three adjacent major chords, the chords directly beneath and going across are going to all be in one key. This is the key of C. C is going to be the tonic, F is the subdominant, and G is the dominant. Okay, now this shape, this idea of the key, now I've omitted the 7, but it is technically here, B diminished. We can rotate this to the side, okay? So G in this case is the 5 chord, and the 5 wants to go back to C, right? We've just established that the 5 wants to go to the 1. C is the 1, F is the 4, G is the 5. So let's go ahead and write that in. I'm going to write it in because it'll help when we start rotating the idea. So right now, we can identify where something is a 5, where is a 1, and where is a 4. Now, if we were in the key of G, these positions, the functional positions, would actually shift. They would rotate also, so that G was now the 1, that C is the 4, right? And that D is the 5. So all that happens is they kind of just move with it. Wherever your 1 will be, that will be your 1. So if you decide you're in the key of G, G is the 1. If you decide you're in the key of D, D is the 1. And so this idea basically is changeable. You can basically redefine all the functional aspects of your key just by rotating the functional aspects. So let's just go ahead and do that. Let's say with D, just so that way we don't get too confused with what I've already written. So here we have D. So let's say D is the 1. That means to say that G is going to be the 4 relative of the 1, just like A is going to be the 5 relative of the 1. Remember, this is the circle of fifths for a reason. The circle of fifths suggests that every note going clockwise is the fifth of the prior note going counterclockwise. So that A is the 5 of D, D is the 5 of G, G is the 5 of C, just like C is the 5 of F. What we're discovering is that all of these are 5s. All of these are technically dominant. This is dominant of that, and it's all relative, depending on what the 1 is. Now, what's interesting is that these are all primary dominants. So, for example, let's just stay in the key of C. And this is kind of critical. This is part of how we are able to identify secondary dominants. And it's one of the parameters, the literal parameters, of what make a secondary dominant secondary. See, because if we were in the key of D, if we were in this key, and we play A as a dominant chord, we're not playing a secondary dominant because A is the 5 of D, right? So when we're in C, G is the 5 of C. So the problem is that if you are resolving to something outside the key, and you're just using the 5-1 cadence, that's not actually a secondary dominant. It's just the primary dominant. And I like to use that phrase because it reminds us that the thing that we're doing is making use of this harmonic tension and the harmonic resolve, the 5 dominant going to the 1. So what does make a secondary dominant? A secondary dominant can be defined as when you choose a secondary chord in your key to be the new 1. So that means that we can't use C as the 1, but we can use anything else as the 1. That means that if F were the 1, we would play C as the 5 of F. And what's interesting about this is that, as we've talked about before in the video about the circle of fifths, the entire inner ring of the circle of fifths is the same as the outer ring, just displaced. And this is because it's proportionate, right? That you'll find that F appears later in the actual circle of fifths on the interior, and it will be displaced. Specifically, if we complete the inner circle, you'll find that actually that D appears here. And this is where we can start, actually. We can start with where the displacement is. D is here, but D is also here. So in a sense, we can associate this D with that one. We find that actually the inner ring, and when we start going forward, we have D, we have A, right? D, A, E, D, A, E. Notice the inner ring is the same as the outer ring. So what this basically tells us is that the inner ring functions like the outer ring in that all of these are also the fifth of the note that is prior to them going clockwise. So that A is the 5 of D. You see that? A is the 5 of D, just like E is the 5 of A. E is the 5 of A, right? So what this tells us is actually how to identify our secondary dominants. So the secondary dominant is when you choose a secondary chord to be the new one, you take this position and you move it. You can move it to here, you can move it to here, or here. And then what you do is you go to the note next to it in the circle of fifths and play that as a dominant chord. Now in the case of the minor chords, when you play C and you're in the key of C major, if you want to play a secondary dominant, you could basically take any of these as a major and then a major chord with a minor seventh here as a dominant chord, and you could resolve to the chord immediately to the right of that. So in this case, if we play E7, we can play A minor right after, and this would be called playing the 5 of the 6. So this is how we actually talk about this. So this is kind of the next phase of this. This initial cadence is the 5 of the 1. And the idea is ultimately when you identify another chord, a secondary chord in your key to be your new dominant, that you ultimately have to identify what chord that is, and that therefore which chord you are playing the dominant of. So in the case of C, the chord directly beneath it is A, which is the 6th chord, the minor 6. And if we play the 5 chord, which is E, as a dominant chord next to it and resolve to the 6, we are playing the 5 of the 6, the 5 of the minor 6 chord. See this? So if we're playing E as E7 and resolving to A minor, we are playing the 5 of the minor 6 because we are playing the 5 and we're resolving to this note which was treated like the 1, but it in fact is the minor 6. If we play A as the dominant of D, we are playing the 5 of the 2, right? Because this is the 2 chord, and we're playing the respective 5 of the minor 2. And we write that like the 5 of the minor 2. The minor 2 is when we play A minor, and we instead play it as an A7, as a major chord with a minor 7th, and resolve to D minor. So this is the idea of the secondary dominant, and I'll just go through some of those examples quickly to show you what they actually sound like. In the key of C, it's very important we remember that these only work when we stay in the key. And as soon as you decide to leave the key, you are doing something called a key change or a modulation. But if we stay in the key of C, this is functionally how to resolve them. Secondary dominants, that is. C, E7, A minor. So that sounds, again, functionally coherent. We have 1, 5 of 6, 6, right? And usually when you read the secondary dominant, that's how you write them. And when you read them, your options are to either resolve to the secondary dominant, which is the secondary chord. So that is, if you play the 5 of 6, you would then play the 6, or you can play the relative major, which is to go back to the 1. So in this case, if we go 1, 5 of 6, 1, that also would work. And this is because they have a relative and interoperable function in terms of functional theory. And let's do the other example. C going to the 5 of 2, so, and then the 2. So C, A7, D minor. Again, same kind of function. And we don't have to go to the minor 2. It is the lawful neutral way of doing it, but another way of doing it is C, A7, F. That would also be good because F is the relative major of D. So you can swap one out for the other, depending on the effect you want. So that ultimately covers secondary dominants to the best of my ability to explain them. As you can tell, I'm exasperated. It is a dense topic, but they're very useful. And they're useful for lots of reasons. Like I said, you can stay within the key, and you can ultimately play a chord outside of the key if you want. But you could also leave the key, and you can use secondary dominants as a way of totally just leaving a key entirely, and that is also really refreshing. So I hope you found this video informative and helpful. If you did, remember to consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. It is the best way to stay in the loop. It definitely motivates me to keep making content like this. I have kind of dreaded making the video about secondary dominants. I might even do another one if I can synopsize it easier. Let me know if this was coherent to you, if this makes sense. If you have any questions, write something in the comments below. As always, you're welcome to reach out for lessons. I have some links in my description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you at the next video. Ciao for now.